Major disruptions for workers, firms, communities, they adjust, of course, to this very new reality. Potentially millions of workers would need to find new jobs. Firms would need to look for new products and markets, and communities would have to look for new sources of growth. Now, again, that's a road we should avoid. We need to see more dialogue, both bilaterally, that's good, but also through the WTO. In fact, this situation, these tensions, are putting a new focus on the multilateral trading system as a place where solutions may be found. And at the root of these tensions that you see out there is the argument that the world has changed significantly and that the trading system is not responsive to these new realities on the ground. And therefore, so goes the argument, the system needs to change in order to properly address these new challenges. Now, some would see this as an opportunity, right, to update the organization and revamp the trading system for a new century. Others have doubts about this emerging discussion and would prefer to focus on completing the ongoing work that we have in the organization. And whatever the precise arguments here, what there is no question on is that this focus on WTO reform or modernization, this is growing very rapidly. A series of substantive debate is beginning to emerge, driven by leaders around the world. And we should, I think, keep in mind the wider context in which this debate is playing out. These are not ordinary times. In some senses, we're still recovering from the 2008 crisis, right? So there are many countries that are still handling the effects and the impact of that crisis. And at the same time, so on top of that, we also have this new era that we are living in the shape of this fourth industrial revolution, as new technologies reshape many aspects of our lives and of the economy. Now, these very historic events have combined to foster a sense of fear and uncertainty about the future, creating an upsurge in anti-trade and even anti-foreign sentiment. Now, one important element here is the perception that trade is taking people's jobs and sending those jobs overseas, when in reality, the driving force behind these job losses is innovation and higher productivity enabled by technology. 80% of jobs lost are because of these sources, not because of trade. But regardless of the causes, it is clear that people feel left behind by economic changes, regardless of what the reasons are. Now, this requires real action. And much of this will be about domestic policies on education, on skills, on adjustment support and other labor market reforms to help workers adapt to the new economic realities. Now, each country will have its own recipe. There is no single recipe for everyone. But one thing is clear. No one is going to be helped by choking off trade. So if we turn our backs on trade and on the outside world, in the end, everybody loses. So while members debate WTO reform, we need to keep a proper perspective on all of these issues. Like I said, the momentum behind this conversation is growing. WTO reform has been raised with me personally in my interactions with a variety of leaders, and no doubt it will be a key issue when we meet at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires in 2 weeks' time. Now, that meeting will be an important moment, and I know that the EU is coming with ideas to put on the table. I will be there, and I will be bringing a strong message about the vital importance of maintaining and strengthening the trading system in everyone's interest. On the substance of the conversation, a variety of initiatives and meetings are being prepared, and a range of priorities have been suggested by WTO members, and that includes by the US, by the EU, by China, Japan, Canada, many others. And these priorities include, for example, resolving disputes and reaching agreements more rapidly and more effectively, addressing a variety of trade distorting practices that are either not covered or only partially covered by existing disciplines, avoiding protectionism and unilateral actions, advancing the current work, and improving notifications and transparency. So these are all important issues, but at present, I would say there is no common view on whether and how they should be taken forward. I would be supporting the members at every stage of the way to find ways of facilitating their work and strengthening the system for the future. And in all of the current discussions, I would say that probably the most urgent issue facing us today is the crisis of the dispute settlement system. Now, the specific issue here is the impasse in appointment of new appellate body members. Now, this could, if we don't address it, this could eventually threaten the functioning of the whole dispute settlement system as we know it. There are some signs that members are engaging more deeply here. Proposals are being brought forward, but we need to see a major shift in gears and positions if we are to make progress. I myself am trying to get these discussions moving forward. This is a real systemic risk and it demands urgent action. To conclude, I think it's clear that we have many challenges before us today, but the key challenge is for us to transform this crisis into an opportunity. The trading system has been under pressure before, and each time it has emerged stronger. In 2008, faced with the worst economic crisis for many decades, the system proved its value. It prevented an outbreak of protectionist measures like many expected at the time, but it did not happen. In 2013, after years of deadlock, we proved that we could deliver negotiated results. So today, we must rise to the challenge again. Indeed, I believe that if we can turn this system around and make it thrive, we need to fight for it like never before. We cannot take the system for granted. It is only as resilient as the members' commitment to defend it and to strengthen it. Lithuania's history is one of resilience in testing times, rising up to face challenges and to build a more prosperous future. This is the kind of leadership that we need now. This is the kind of leadership that we need in Geneva. So I count on your continued support together with the EU to ensure that the trading system continues to underpin all of these benefits that I have detailed today, because I'm absolutely certain that together we can ensure that trade plays its full role in building the brighter future that we all want to see. So I hope I have somehow answered that question, what's in it for us. And if I didn't, I will have a lot of people who help me in the front here to answer it in a proper and satisfactory manner. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General. Our third speaker is a... Oh, yes, very good idea. Thank you very much, Director General. Our third speaker is a very familiar figure at the Brussels podium this year, and she is the EU's Commissioner for Trade, Cecilia Malmstrom.
Thank you very much. Ministers, Director General, Ambassadors, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's an honor to be here today, and of course, as have my previous speakers, I'm also very happy to be here on the 100th anniversary year that you are celebrating. 100 years since the Council of Lithuania signed the Act of Independence of Lithuania. A council made up of 20 people, different ages, social status, professions, and political affiliation. No women, but you are making up for that today with strong women in your society. Lithuania, as you know, has a long history of trade, one that goes back longer than the independence. Every Lithuanian knows the story of the Grand Duke Gediminas. In 1323, as you might remember, he established Lithuania as a hub of trade and activity, addressing letters to Cologne, Bremen, Visby, and many other cities of the Holy Roman Empire. And Gediminas invited knights, squires, merchants, doctors, smiths, and many more professions to his land. And they were all welcome to Lithuania to be exempted from tariffs and taxes, to practice trade or their faith without any restriction. And a few centuries down the line, I'm happy to see that Lithuanians are still committed global traders, only looking here in this country and your economy for evidence. As you know, we have recently closed an agreement with Japan. We hope that it will enter into force very early next year after the European Parliament has voted in December. It is the biggest bilateral trade agreement ever negotiated, covering 630 million people. And when signed, approved and implemented, it will account for more than 1/4 of the world's GDP. Japan today is a highly protected market with custom taxes of nearly 40% on beef, 30% on chocolate, 50% on wine, 40% on cheese. And our agreement will bring down those barriers, stimulating businesses while passing on savings to consumers. And this will boost trade from the European Union, and Lithuania has a lot to gain. As we speak here, plywood, pet food, circuit boards are leaving Klaipėda and setting sail for Japan. And on the way, they will pass containers with goods coming back to Lithuanian consumers. Both sides will benefit and trade will grow. Business will gain from bigger markets, consumers from lower prices, and many more products. Today, Japan is Lithuania's 13th biggest trade partner outside the EU. You export 119 million euros of product to Japan and import 80 million euros. 200 companies here export to Japan, and over 2,000 jobs depend on these exports. Totally in the EU, we talk about 740,000 jobs, and the agreement has not even entered into force yet. We also have closed agreements with Mexico, Singapore, Vietnam, and we hope to see them ratified during this Commission's term. We feel the impacts of old agreements, such as the one with South Korea and the one that mentioned by the Foreign Minister with Canada. We hope to have an agreement with Chile, and as we speak, my team is negotiating with the team of Mercosur in Brussels. So we are moving ahead here as well. We opened negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. We negotiated with Indonesia and Tunisia. So things are looking good for EU trade. We stand to gain a lot, economically, of course, and that is the main purpose of trade. But trade is more than just economy. So I am proud of what we have achieved the past few years. When I took over the trade portfolio a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, it was quite a difficult time. There were protesters every day outside my office. People did not trust what we delivered. We had criticisms from all the sides, and as Director General said, trade was blamed for all pains of globalization or domestic policy failures. Some of that criticism was not fair, of course, but some of it deserved a response. So the answer to them was highlighted in our strategy, Trade for All, aiming to transform trade and really to make it more responsible, more trustworthy, and beneficial to all. So we were criticized for being secretive. So we committed to be the most transparent trade negotiator of the world. And today we publish all negotiating texts from the Commission, draft mandates of our agreement. We have user-friendly material online, negotiating positions, and other background material available for everybody. We are engaged with the civil society all across the European Union, of course, but more regularly in Brussels, where we have a permanent advisory group with representatives from business, big and small, but also from the civil society, consumer organizations, environmental organizations, and others who advise us on trade agreements and also indicate what's working and what's not working. So we are gradually trying to rebuild the trust in our trade, and we have doubled our efforts to spread the benefits of globalization. This is something that very much belongs to national competences, of course, through education, skills, tax systems, social welfare systems, and so on. But we have been focusing on small and medium-sized companies because they are underrepresented in trade, and still they are the backbone of our economy. 99% of European companies are SMEs, and they create most of the jobs. 82% of Lithuanian businesses that export to Japan are small and medium-sized companies. So they can help us to spread the benefits of globalization by creating jobs and new opportunities in the different communities across the European Union, not only in the big cities. We were accused of using trade policy to lower standards. So our response was to embed the values that we have in the European Union in our agreements. We are a very big trader in the world, so we have a responsibility on how we trade. So we have trade and sustainability development chapters in all our agreements. They include provisions on human rights, social justice, high labor standards, environmental standards, based on international conventions, ILO conventions, International Labour Organization, United Nations conventions, multilateral environmental agreements. They are all included in our agreement. And this is not the only way we have updated our trade policy and our agreements, because the global economy is so complicated today. Technological innovation, globalization, complex regulatory environment. So, of course, all that needs to be reflected in our trade agreements. Again, taking Canada as an example, the agreement cuts 98% of tariffs, boosting trade and investment. But it also opens up markets, bringing down barriers on a wider scale. Now 1 year has passed since its application, and we start to see positive results. 1 year is short in trade world, but we already have beginning to enjoy some advantages. Lithuania's exports have risen by 15% to over 33 million euros. Furniture is 1/3 of your export to Canada. They have gone up with more than 9%. Fish, crustacean exports have doubled. And that's good news for all of us. Overall, exports have increased with 7%. And CETA covers many things. It lowers non-tariff barriers too, in services. Over 30 billion euros in services were traded between EU and Canada in 2015, and they are going to become more important in the years to come. European firms can now bid for European public contracts. European qualifications are recognized in Canada. And we have similar provisions in Japan. There we also have a chapter on corporate governance, and it will open up Japan's service markets to European firms. European companies will bid for more public contracts in Japan, and particularly in the railway sector. And it will give recognition to over 200 certified European delicacies, so-called geographical indications, protecting them from cheap imitations. So throughout these years, we have been focusing on our negotiating agenda in quality and quantity, and we are seeing the results. Each agreement we close is much more than economy. They are also strategic alliances. And these days, we do need allies. And we have plans here. It's a system we praise and price over all others in trade, under threat, of course, the multilateral system. Enshrined in the World Trade Organization, it has underpinned global trade for decades, allowing stability and gradual opening of markets. Without it, there is no rule book. International trade would become totally anarchic. Smaller countries would be bullied, and companies would fall victim for unfair practices. No reliability, no stability. But in the European Union, with many, many other countries of the world, we do believe in a rule-based global system, and we are prepared to stand up for it. The system, as has been said by the two previous speakers, is challenged today. Unilateral actions taken by individual countries in violation of WTO rules. Some believe they can decide alone, that we don't need the multilateral system, but they are wrong. Of course, the current WTO system is not perfect. We need to update it, we need to strengthen it, we need to modernize it. And we are working in the European Union with a very strong support and close cooperation of all the member states on a plan to reform it. First, to save the appellate body. As Roberto said, this is the most urgent task to do, because without enforcement of the rules, they don't mean anything. And secondly, to update the rule book. We are still using today the rules of 1995. Little has changed, and we need to write new rules that correspond to the new challenges, for instance, in industrial subsidies, forced technology transfer, etc. And we need to strengthen the internal processes of WTO, more transparency, new processes to resolve conflicts and disputes at an early stage, and allowing countries to move ahead as discussions are moving today on e-commerce, for instance, with full transparency, of course, and allowing other countries to join later. So this is what we try to do when it comes to updating the WTO to become a relevant organization for the future. Because in the European Union, we are a committed traders, believing in open rule-based trade, but there has to be WTO, there has to be global rules, because elsewhere, otherwise, everybody would suffer. And there would be bullying, and hard power would become the norm. So to overcome the current crisis, we need these alliances that we are creating gradually through trade and many other ways in our foreign policy. We need our like-minded partners. We do that through our trade agreements and our shared goal in reforming and saving the WTO. And this is a conference to discuss more in detail how to do that. We are grateful to all the EU member states who support us in these efforts. We are grateful for the strong support that you give us when we speak on behalf of the whole European Union. But we need to remain united in our support for open trade. And we need citizens, workers, business, NGOs, everybody also in this debate. And that's why I hope we will have a very good discussion this afternoon. So thank you for your dedication. Thank you to the Lithuanian Foreign Ministry for organizing this. I'm looking very much forward to the discussions.
Yes. Thank you very much, Commissioner. So after that excellent warm-up, I would now like to invite all of our 7 panelists to come and take their seats on the stage. Don't be shy. Thank you very much. You should all have microphones available. Shout if you don't. So we've had an excellent introduction there to some of the big themes of the conference, and I'd now just like to introduce and get a few thoughts from some of the other panelists who have not had the opportunity to speak before. And first of all, I would like to call on Anne-Mari Virolainen, the Minister of Foreign Trade and Development from Finland, who can, I hope, give us another EU perspective on this. And I would like, perhaps, if you could talk a little bit about some of the new issues on the WTO agenda and how they look like from Helsinki: digital trade, investment facilitation, SMEs, trade and gender, and so forth. And from a Finnish point of view, why and how do we need to adapt the current multilateral rules to fit in with the demands of this era? Is it working?
I think it's working. So do you all hear me? Yeah, that's good. That's good. So, Your Excellencies, it's great to be here. As some of the previous speakers, I also want to share with you that I used to work for Swedish Telia and spent quite many times in this beautiful city in the early 1990s. So that's a very long time ago, so I won't be your local guide in this city anymore. But about the issues of global trade and what is the big picture right now. So I suppose we all share the same idea that there are a lot of challenges, but there are also a lot of possibilities. And especially for a small country like Finland and also as Lithuania. So for us it's very important that we have the rules-based international trading system. It's very important for us. And I also hope that we all agree that we have a need for the WTO that works and delivers for us and our companies and also our workers. And we already have heard what improvements should we have, like with the dispute settlement system and the update of the WTO rulebook. But you asked about some new issues. Small and medium-sized companies, e-commerce, investments, facilitation, and one very special issue for me is trade and gender. And as we all know, that the world is changing really rapidly, and business logic is also changing when transforming into a digitalized world. So we need rules that enable e-commerce. And at the same time, we need to avoid digital protectionism and try to prevent barriers to create also new digital barriers. And for Finland, especially regarding e-commerce, so one very important issue for us is that the data keeps flowing across all borders. And then about investment facilitation, so it's obvious that we need to look at what kind of policies, what kind of measures, and what kind of best practices are needed for investments to flow. And from our point of view, it's very important that businesses have that kind of environment that is very transparent and very predictable. So we know that there is still resistance among some members about how to proceed with the investment facilitation process, but let's don't give up. We need to continue that. And then about the small and medium-sized companies, we know that the vast majority of our companies are small and medium-sized. And in Europe, they provide 2 out of the 3 jobs, and they generate more than half of the value added. So, but there are still major obstacles for small and medium-sized companies. So it's obvious for us to pay special attention in all negotiations, in WTO or elsewhere. So it was December 2017 in Buenos Aires where informal working group was established. But our opinion is that we should turn it into the formal work group and continue working the issues of the small and medium-sized sized companies. And then the last issue about trade and gender. It's very important that we will have positive effect on women. We know that trade have raised very many women from poverty, and they have created millions of jobs in industries who employ women. And we have programs such as Aid for Trade, and that can be used to support women entrepreneurs and workers. And Finland is supporting women entrepreneurs as a part of our program with the International Trade Center. And we have also been financing Untact worked as the analytical side since 2012. So we welcome the joint declaration on trade and women's economic empowerment, and this may be one topic where the first headway can be made in bilateral agreements. So in that regard, the inclusion of a separate trade and gender chapter for the EU-Chile free trade agreement negotiation is excellent. Thank you, Cecilia, for that. And if the experiences of that chapter is very positive, so I believe that we could replicate that also in other agreements. So it's good that we are able to negotiate, and we need to come up with meaningful rules. And with rules, I mean that those also create application and rules that can be enforced. So in some ways we are probably talking more about soft law, but regardless if it's hard law or soft law, the key is that we have as many members as possible to sign on to discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'd like to turn now to Ms. Ingrida Shimonita, who of course will be a very familiar figure to you in this hall and maybe becoming an even more familiar figure over the next few months. And I would like to ask you to deepen the question about inclusive trade and this question of how governments can set trade policy either on their own or through multilateral agreements to support societies, ensure social fairness and employment fairness. In other words, to deal with some of those bigger questions that we've already heard addressed from the podium.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very valid point, and to a large extent maybe these issues left unaddressed actually cause this negative attention from the society, where society does not dig into details that much, whether they lost their jobs because of trade or because of innovation or whatever. When a couple of years ago I still was a teacher at Vilnius University, I remember having a slide from, was that Gregory Mankiw's book, about the agreements and disagreements among economists on different issues. And the phrase that international trade is good for all of us was one on the top, where you can say that there is like 95% consensus among economists that this is true. So then my students kept asking me, so why we still have trade barriers or subsidies or tariffs or whatever? How can it be so that actually 95% of economists agree on the thing and still this thing is not our reality? So I was trying to explain them. They were political science students, so maybe it was easier to explain to them than to an ordinary citizen that the problem is that in case of a benefit, you have a very wide and thin layer of benefit that is spread across basically all the society. So there is no trade union, no constituency, nobody to actually represent this benefit. And in case of any potential loss, let's say discontinuation of production in one country because of reallocation to another country, or some job losses, there is always some particular owner, some particular worker, some particular politician elected in that constituency, and that's how you get this debate sometimes a little bit unbalanced. And then there is a responsibility for politicians, both nationally and internationally, to address those issues and to try and build a decent dialogue with the society about the benefits and potential dangers of changes in trade patterns. So, of course, some of things were mentioned both by Commissioner and by Director General and by Minister, that there are some policies that are up to a national government to implement or to design, and they are good for whatever developments, whether they happen because of technological change or whether they happen because of some changes in trade, being that lifelong learning, labor laws, labor contract law, or possibility to change your qualifications in a quick and smooth manner. But I would say that there are also some things that need international attention, because one of the issues about the international trade, one of the problem is that there is a perception that the benefits of trade are not allocated, I would not say equally, but in a fairly manner. I mean, the concentration of value is in a too narrow circle of countries, people, or companies. So what actually we can do about it? And the downsides can be very much dislocated in other areas. So what can we do about it? And some things were mentioned by Madam Commissioner that in our debate about new trade agreements, we need to incorporate more and more international standards that sort of is a set of rules that we mind about the environment, that we mind about the labor culture in the country who is our trading partner, that we mind about many other issues. And now one of the issues that has not been mentioned so far is an issue of tax planning or tax-based shifting, because the potential of a particular country to address the concerns of its society about education, about lifelong learning and qualifications and whatever, very much supporting SMEs, very much depend on availability of resources. And sometimes those resources are being shifted somewhere in a rather, I would not say fraudulent, but in an aggressive way, where we need more transparency. We need more transparency on international financial system, tax havens, offshores, whatever. And if we can sort of harmonize this dialogue on international trade with this set of new thinking, new rules, more fairness, more transparency, I think that could be something that we can do on an international level as governments.
Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to bring in the business point of view, and we are lucky to have with us Vidmantas Janulevičius, who apart from being the chairman of the board of BOD Group, has perhaps the coolest business card I've ever seen. And his company, as many of you will know, makes CDs, DVDs, Blu-ray, and more lately, solar cells. And so you're a big exporter, so clearly trade deals are very important. But on the other hand, as we were talking over coffee just before, your company has had some problems with, for example, dumping and also with intellectual property issues with China. So tell us a little bit about your experience and what it tells you about some of the things that we need to be thinking about in setting international trade policy.
Yeah, thank you for this kind of topics questions, but I would try to move out from my own company now. Okay. I will talk more as a Vice President of Lithuanian Confederation of Industrialists. And in this case, of course, our company has, we're exporting 92% of our goods. We are producing not only the solar panels, solar cells, optical discs since last 20 years, but and ophthalmic lenses. That means a lot of different directions on the export. Yeah, it's not easy, of course. We are for free trade agreement as a Lithuanian Confederation of Industrialists, and of course my company as well, because we depend on the export. We are a middle-sized company. We are still not the big ones, because Lithuania, as our minister has mentioned, over 80% is the SMEs, you know. And we are very dependent on the rules, which is playing our neighbors. Yeah, and this is the main things what I would like to say from the beginning. What Lithuanian business is very dependent on the rules, and how is our neighbors or countries around us, or in Asia or in Eastern countries, they follow these rules. You know, of course, in these cases, now the biggest topics is, of course, with our eastern neighbors, Russia. We have a lot of problems now about the gas prices, because we have still different gas prices inside Russia and outside. That's mean a lot of our producers are struggling now, especially fertilizers, because this, if the Russia export the fertilizers, of course the prices are totally different in comparison with Lithuania. Yeah? This is a main topic now, as well as the cement producers. Lithuania, biggest companies, they again issue the same problems with the gas prices, because the main component to produce the cement and the fertilizers is the gas. And if we have the different rules, and if there is a different pricings, that's mean our customers or our producers pays twice. We pay for the bigger price of the gas or energy resources. At the same time, we can't sell our products even cheaper, even more expensive. But to look globally, you know, of course we support the WTO. Yeah, it must be some rules, and I hope, and we discussed this morning with Mr. Azevedo, I hope it will be possible to keep US on board during this time, during this challenging time, because if the biggest country would leave that association, of course the future rules could be difficult. That means must be some compromises, I think, founded, and of course it's a big issue for you to find this, but we need to have such organization. We support this organization as a Lithuanian Confederation of Industrialists and Business Europe, because we are part of Business Europe, European Lobby Association. We need to follow this, and we will support as we can. And of course, another topic which I would like to add, it's respect the IP rules. Yeah, we understand what the future best countries will be, not the countries who now leading the world, who has the energy resources, oil, gas, and so on. The future country, it will be the country who would have the newest and the best technologies. Yeah, we understand. I think all of us understand this. This is very important for SMEs companies. Yeah, that's mean how to touch the world, how to sell to any places. Yeah, and that case is Lithuania and Finland as well. We have really a lot of new startups who's doing different things, starting from the energy resources, blockchain technologies, and so on. And very important, what WTO would follow the rules how to respect the IP, because in these cases, if somebody is taking over what maybe taxpayers of EU pays for the research and development, or to universities or to the institutes, if it will be transferred so easy to another country who not invest so much money, this I think it's a problem, yeah, because then it's simple cheating. And there is a lot of forms in the different governments, you know, how to avoid this, how to take over these newest technologies. I think two things: strictly rules and respect the IP property, especially technological IP property. This gives the equal possibilities to all countries to develop, to grow, and to create our future economy.
Okay, thank you very much. Last but very much not least, I would like to come at the far end, and he is a council member of the Alliance of Lithuanian Consumer Organizations. And perhaps, Mr. Kupšys, if you wouldn't mind, if you could address the question of what is it that you think make trade agreements beneficial to consumers, and do you think that the kind of trade agreements we see worldwide at the moment are meeting those requirements? And if not, what needs to change?
Yes, so in answering to this question, we have to take a look at the title of this conference. So what is in it for us, the consumers? And of course, there are benefits for industrialists, benefits for politicians, benefits for some other market actors, possibly. But for the consumers, so far, I would say there are not so many benefits, not so much. And as Madame Šimonytė said, there is only a thin layer of benefits, possibly. But I would add to this remark that there are huge perceived risks to trade, to free trade agreements, perceived risks. Some of them are not real, but we have to address those. So, we agree that free trade agreements can reduce prices and enhance choice. But that's exactly why our European umbrella organization, BEUC, is very supportive of free trade, but not at any cost. Free trade is good, but not at any cost. And there's no concrete proof of price decreases, and there is okay, I could agree there is some better choice for the consumers, but I would raise another aspect of it. For Lithuanian consumers, buying Lithuania means that only Lithuanian apples are delivered kind of from next door, and all the other global goods are delivered via huge distances, and it means also some negative impact on the environment. So reducing of prices by FTAs is not automatic, and it depends on a lot of factors, like competitive pressure on the market. So there is no guarantee each free trade agreement would bring those benefits. For example, for CETA, we criticized it because it brings possibly 0.5% of overall deflationary pressure on the market, but in the end, it's not that much. In this regard, I would say, using a metaphor, that when you put too many stones into the basket could be just very heavy, and it could become very difficult to lift that basket. That's what happened with CETA, and putting a lot of elements which are not necessarily directly free trade related makes free trade agreements much more difficult to sell to the public. What happened with CETA, I would think, and adding a lot of more things like gender equality, environmental standards, etc., makes those huge, so to say, agreements difficult to negotiate, I think. So our suggestion is keep it simple, keep it kind of really manageable, and it's about protection of consumers as well. We should not forget that consumer protection mechanisms should be in the heart of the free trade agreement, not somewhere kind of on a footnote, but we need really working mechanisms to ensure that free trade agreement brings no real risks for the society, for the health, for example. Like by the United States, those things are considered as trade irritants, and of course we cannot agree with that. The free trade agreement has to have some standard, so to say, set of elements, and we at our European umbrella organization, BEUC, prepared checklists for every upcoming free trade agreements, like Australia, New Zealand, as well as set of rules for e-commerce deals, which are in the heart of WTO recent initiatives. So I have left few sets of these booklets outside of the hall at the reception, and if there are some left, please you can pick it up upon exit, and if there are no more left, then you can ask me. I have the last copy with me. So to conclude, I'd like to stress the importance of transparency, and to know what's in it for consumers. We need to know what's being negotiated on our behalf, and it means from the mandate to the agreement. So the Commission has done a lot on this, and now we hope that you, ministers, will follow their suit in the Council, and we hope that you will join this effort systemically, not only by case-by-case basis. So that's my short introduction.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the first round. I'm now going to open up into a panel discussion, and I also want you to be thinking of questions, of which I'm sure you have many, because in time I will come to the audience for some questions from you guys. I'm going to ask you a few more questions to our panelists. Please, if any of you want to respond to anything that is being said or has been said, please just raise your hands and we can get a discussion going, and that will be great. Now, before we go on, I think we owe ourselves a little congratulation, because we've been speaking for over an hour on the subject of global trade, and no one has yet mentioned President Donald Trump. I'm going to change that. Exactly. Exactly. Well, I made a sort of reference to it. So we will talk about both of these things. First of all, Foreign Minister, I'd like to come to you. You, in your portfolio, obviously, it extends well beyond trade, and you are the Foreign Minister of a country which, as everyone in this hall knows, is a very committed member of both NATO and the European Union, but also has historically good relations with the United States as well. And I would like to ask you to give our audience a bit of an insight into how you handle some of the diplomacy of what we're seeing in terms of these multilateral trade disputes, many involving the United States, and how that perhaps fits in with some of Lithuania's broader strategic goals, such as, for instance, greater energy diversity and imports of US liquefied natural gas, for example. So give us a little picture.
Thank you. Difficult to give a little picture because it's a very big deal, but you're right. United States, needless to say, it's a founding country of WTO, major trade dealer and player, also major player in the world in all aspects. So to imagine that any sustainable solution without the United States is possible. So given having said this, of course, we should recognize that it's not the best time for free trade. The current administration not very enthusiastic, basically working on bilateral solutions rather than multilateral. We still believe that, you know, it's not over, and frankly, while meeting politicians in the United States from both parties, Republicans, Democrats, there are many believers in free trade. Even I would say, although it's not mentioned, TTIP not mentioned, which was put aside, but we were also supporting. We still believe it would be big impetus for an energy would give even some additional GDP on both sides of the ocean, jobs, and even contribution for rules of trade rules. Would be. It's not happened, but I shouldn't say it would be right to say that it's over, so to say. It's put aside for a while, but I believe time will come. What was invested, and especially those who believe, as I said, it's possible and maybe even necessary to continue to have these relations. Because United States, as we just talked with Director General, also they are engaged. They are talking on some issues, and let's say like transparency or level playing field or some other areas. They're also trying to contribute to the common thinking, and we should build on this positive example. So really not easy, as we already all recognized, but it's not such a big drama, because it should be really we should draw from something what is positive and build on that, and that's the only exit and solution. Because the United States really a major power and very important. Needless to say, very important also in security, you know, and all our fears in Europe. And I'm really very sad because of rhetorics, which now from time to time, isolation, division, making gaps. It's, I believe, a big strategic mistake. We shouldn't help those who doing that. You mentioned briefly this energy aspects. It's again a very important example. We, since I believe end of 2014, we consider ourselves as energy island in that bad sense, totally isolated, dependent on single source. All supplies, it's relatively also reflected in the gas price, especially. It was more than anywhere in Europe, by the way. And even during the construction of LNG terminal, which is done by the end of 2014, it was like breakthrough, like a game changer, not only for us, but in the region. and we not island anymore. Really, we can really play in more transparent way, more competitive way. And here, I'm coming to US role, possible role, it has to do with the shale gas. They're still looking for the solutions for export, and definitely also there are some movements also in the European Union and US trade from 0 towards 2.8 billion, I believe, billion cubic meters of gas was received in the European Union. There were also a couple shipments in our seaport in Klaipėda, not yet regular, but nevertheless. This is also an addition to the market and to competition. And exactly would like to see as a player in the European gas market, United States can do that. So we see the same strategy here and same approach. All in all, everything what undermines our collective rules, looking for the individual solutions, definitely we're not happy, but we are ready to constructively keep dialogue and looking optimistically.
Thank you. Director General, the Minister had a fairly optimistic take in some ways, engagement is not dead and so forth. How do you see it? I mean, do you share that optimism? And perhaps if you could update us all on the latest on what is, most people agree, and you mentioned yourself, the most pressing question facing the WTO, the appellate body, and its future, where we are on that, and how far we are from it actually becoming the crisis that many fear, and what you think now is the way forward.
Well, as far as the appellate body is concerned, I don't think we have news for anybody at this point in time. We know what the concerns are, but when you ask, okay, so you have difficulties with this, this, and that, then how do we solve that? We don't have that answer. So that is very difficult to handle. But my view is that this larger conversation about upgrading the system and reforming the system can be helpful in shedding light on how to solve the issue of the appellate body. I think the United States has made clear that they have difficulties with the system, that the system is not working properly, that we take too long to decide, that there are many rules that do not capture what is happening outside on the ground today. And together with other countries, including with the EU, they have been engaging to suggest things that can be done that could reform the system. I would say that early on, their position was much more reluctant, much more rejective. They would say, we need bilaterals because multilaterally we can't do anything. I don't think that this is the position any longer. I think today they would still prefer to do bilateral deals. It's easier, it's faster, etc. But they also recognize that the system is important. More than once they have said that the system, if it didn't exist, it needed to be invented. But having said that, it needs to be reformed. It needs to be updated. And I think that's a fair point. And members in the WTO are discussing precisely that. But it's still very early in this conversation to tell how far we're going. But I think that if you compare about where we were a year ago and where we are now, I think there was significant progress in terms of constructive engagement on the part of the Americans. They're very active, for example, on fisheries subsidies. They're very, very active there. They're very, very active on electronic commerce and the conversations that we have in the WTO now on electronic commerce. They tabled a proposal for transparency and notifications very, very recently. They are probably the member that brought more cases to the WTO dispute settlement system. That's a paradox somehow, where they block the appellate body appointments, but they are the ones who are bringing the most cases to the WTO dispute settlement system. So engagement there is. Now we have to make a little bit of sense of how to use that engagement in a way that help us move forward.
So I'd like to ask you a supplementary or a question on that subject of using the engagement. I mean, one effect of this disruption has been that it's opened a conversation which can go more widely and perhaps be beneficial in some ways. I mean, we heard, for example, Mr. Kupchis saying that price reductions are not automatic results of trade deals. And we also heard you say that, look, the idea that trade deals are costing jobs is an exaggeration, because 80% of jobs are lost because of technology. Now, that of course still leaves 20% which are not. Do you think that two things? Number one, that perhaps advocates of free trade have overplayed some of the benefits, and that we need to have a sort of a renewed focus on what is correct to claim and what it's not, and also secondly, do you think that trade negotiations need to do more to widen their scope to include, for example, things that speak to the likely employment effects of a particular aspect of deals, and that this is something that needs to be more formalized in the system, and that would be not only morally good but also practically helpful in terms of saying to people that you're not being abandoned?
I think this conversation cannot be overly simplified. Clearly, to be out there saying that trade does not cause any kind of disruption would be a lie. Of course it does. Of course it does. Of course some will be displaced. Of course some sectors of the economy are going to feel the strain. But it is also true that it is going to be a net benefit for the economy. Now, I have severe difficulties with someone telling me that trade does not reduce prices. Severe difficulties with that, because that's economics 101. I mean, when you want to raise prices domestically, what do? You stop imports. And automatically the prices go up. Now, it's a complicated challenge for the common citizen. Because if you tell the common citizen, how would you like? How do you see trade? Do you see trade as a positive factor? And we have polls that show that. Then the regular citizens say yes. They say, well, what happens with the person who is displaced, who loses his job because of trade? No, that's bad. That's bad. Okay, so but trade causes that. But trade also lowers the prices on the shelves, and I would dispute with anybody who says that it's not true, but it does. Now the question is, then you ask the common citizen, are you ready to give me part of your salary? No, 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 no. My salary you don't touch. But the moment that the prices go up, I'm taking your salary away. Part of your salary is going to help somebody else. So this conversation has to be sophisticated. It cannot be overly simplified. There are costs to the economy. The problem that we have, another argument, is that, well, these people lost jobs, so some jobs were lost, but other jobs were created. In fact, you create more jobs than you take away. But the problem is that for that guy who lost his job, that's no consolation. Because he's not the one who's going to occupy the new job that is being created in another sector of the economy. So you have to take all of these elements into consideration. Now, the net benefit for the economy is positive. I have no doubts about that. But there will be structural disruptions. And you have to have domestic policies that take care of those. So how do you transition the person from one position to another? How do you support that person who is unemployed between the time that it takes to train him to occupy another position? All those are very important questions. The questions that you mentioned, should trade agreements involve things like environmental standards or labor standards? I don't have any problem with that at all. At all. I think that's something that could and should be discussed. And I think that maybe the world was not ready for this kind of conversation a few years back. Maybe it is now. I don't know. You have to try. In some of the conversations, this is already emerging. I think we should be open-minded about that. And the biggest problem with the conversation about trade is that it's usually oversimplified. For political reasons, for whatever reasons. And we need to look at all the elements that are involved in this conversation, and you cannot simplify it if you want to have a meaningful conversation.
Minister Virolainen, you come from a country that has a reputation for socially progressive policies. How has the Finnish government dealt with some of the questions that the Director General has just touched on then? In other words, dealing with potential negative effects of trade agreements, whether it be unemployment or other things. What's the Finnish experience?
Actually, I fully agree with the Director General, and we don't have any problems with free trade. Actually, I yesterday visited one car factory very close to where I live. They produce Mercedes-Benz for US market, and they have, I hope I remember the right numbers, 361 robots, and every day they employ more and more workers. It's about the cost efficiency and effectivity. So we have seen, and also if you lose one job in one factory, so if you haven't followed what happened with your know-how and expertise, so then you don't find a job. And actually we are investing really much money in our next year's budget to get people the know-how what is needed in today's labor force, and we are not giving them new like free tuition fees. So we try to get short training, that kind of training that is needed in different companies, so that people get really fast the ability to work. So that's in a short way.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to invite perhaps the two Lithuanian representatives at the end to comment on this from your different perspectives about how is this really a question of communication mostly about the benefits of free trade, or is there something more to it than that? And I mean, if so, how do you change the narrative in the way that the Director General has described, and obviously feel strongly about what's the Lithuanian experience there?
Let me reflect on this this way. And because the issue is really so simple, really so complex, you cannot put it in a very simplified way of free trade agreements mean better prices for consumers and increased choice and all the benefits and etc. So the narrative is exactly very simplified in most of the communicational messages that we hear constantly about free trade. And we have to take into account environmental, more and more important environmental issues. We have to think about showing consumers that they are at the center of the free trade agreements, for example. And to achieve this means a change in a mindset for the decision makers. Because beforehand, we kind of very comfortably lived in a liberal capitalist society, thinking that free trade is the ultimate goal and ultimate method of achieving global prosperity. Now this is a little bit questionable. This thesis is really put on question with all the aspects that came up recently, with increasing air pollution, the exploitation of earth resources, etc. So it's becoming more and more multidimensional than before, when approximately 20 or 30 years ago I was a student, I was also a big believer of free trade for all and united global world trading in everything.
Well, thank you. I would say that this is not only a question of communication, but this is a more global phenomenon, and we can use this pattern for other issues where you have politicians deciding on behalf of their, so to say, herd. Because before one might say that, you know, we are here elected to do things for you, so trust us, we know how to do things, and this is for your best. And whatever decisions you take, international trade or tax policy or whatever policies, especially on international issues where you have some sort of set of lords of rings who decide on some global rules and people do not get anything about it. But in current situation, I mean, in current patterns of how information flows on different issues, whatever, be from international trade to international politics to local factory closure or whatever, I think it's even more a challenge for politicians not to try and beat around the bush, because this way they are creating an environment for fake news, useless debates, scenarios, or things, or some concepts that can be very much untrue, but very hard to sort of contain and discuss as you run after the flow. So I think this is both with national politics and international politics, this is a must for politicians to be as transparent as possible and not to try and hide some particular aspects that maybe are not that beneficial or not that clear to the general public, just hoping that maybe nobody will notice. In current juncture with social networks, with social media, someone will definitely notice that, and this might be your biggest failure and your biggest mistake that can actually ruin a very good cause for white society. So I think this is not only an issue of communication, because there are always numbers behind that. Numbers of working places, numbers of reduction in tariffs, numbers of loss in budget income, and numbers in rise of exports or imports or whatever. There are always numbers behind that, but there is also a must to communicate as clearly and as fairly as one potentially can.
Thank you.
Just a very short remark. Possibly, let me give you a kind of fictional example. If we go to the shop and we see the price of some product expressed in euros, and you see, okay, this local product is more, the imported product is cheaper than the local one, so I buy imported product. But then imagine the fictional CO2 figure, the carbon print added to this euro figure, and you see this carbon footprint figure is less for a locally produced good, and the imported good has, of course, the higher carbon figure. So, I mean, if we were given the really full picture of free trade in the more kind of a multi-dimensional way, then possibly the consumers would think twice before buying the imported product.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner, I'd like to ask you to respond to that in some way. First of all, in a general sense, do you think the EU and EU countries have done a good job of communicating honestly on trade, in the round. So, taking into account not just issues of price and convenience, but environmental impact and the impact on jobs and so forth. And then I'd like to ask you about a specific, perhaps, dilemma in trade policy. At the moment, the EU is looking at whether to withdraw the everything but arms trade preferences from Myanmar and Cambodia. Now, I've worked in both of those countries, so I'm very well aware of the political repression, as many people here will be, with the Rohingya in Myanmar, and then in Cambodia, an autocratic prime minister who's basically swept away all opposition and has been in power for more than 30 years. So no one doubts that those are very serious cases. But of course, as you well know, the EU's approach has had some criticism from both businesses and rights groups who say the result of this will be to put people out of work, many of them women, who work in factories that are affected, depending, I know, on how and whether this is carried through. I know that is still to be decided. But do cases like that feel like a dilemma to you? Do you have mixed feelings when you take them forward?
Starting with the first one, on communication, have we done enough? No, I don't think so. And that was clear, especially a couple of years ago when we had these huge demonstrations on trade, where I think that many of us had taken free trade for granted. And when we started to engage with people, and I certainly travel a lot around the European Union a lot to listen, and people say, well, what does trade have to do with me? And they all have their jeans and their iPhones, and they say, well, what about that iPhone? Yeah, what about that iPhone? It has nothing to do with trade. So then that's when I realized we've not done our job to explain that. And that's also when we started to engage, to make it more inclusive, more transparent, a lot more dialogue, and also emphasizing that the EU has a responsibility on how we trade, and to do that in a sustainable way. And the Commission can do that. We can do more, but we've been really engaging in trying to spread as much information and engage with others. But I think that it is not, I mean, not the role of Brussels to sell trade agreements. It's also the role of member states, because member states empower us to do trade agreements, but the Commission doesn't trade. We do these agreements on behalf of 28 member states. So these countries, all of them need to take that dialogue at home with their members of parliament, with the civil society, with their citizens in general, and to engage to do that. Now that has changed much more to the better, but on TTIP, which was so controversial, it was quite sad to see that so many countries were hiding behind the Commission and said, well, yeah, it's very good that you do TTIP, it's fantastic for our economy. And then they went out to the press and said, wow, the Commission is pushing. I mean, it was a lot of hypocrisy there, I have to say. Not anybody here present, but then of course you need to behave that, to take that role in a responsible way to engage with your citizens. When it comes to environment, well, of course, I mean we can choose not to trade, only have local products. There is a perfectly possibility for everybody to buy local products only, if they want. And I think that the consumer awareness is certainly growing immensely right now. There's a big demonstration today in Brussels, and the average age of those who are there are 14. Huh? The school children demonstrating for tougher EU policies on climate change today, outside, well, not particularly my office, but outside the Commission premises today. So there is a lot of awareness. But also, there are certain products you cannot get from your local market. So there has to be a change. And what we try to do, unfortunately, that is put on hold, and Roberto knows that very well. We try to push through an international agreement on environmental goods to make it easier and cheaper to trade in environmental friendly products, so that we would take away tariffs on technology or machinery that were good for the environment. That, unfortunately, is on hold right now because of well, some countries not engaging in that, but it's not dead, so I hope that one day we could take it out of the freezer. To your other question, that is, of course, extremely difficult. Now, we use trade as a tool to help developing countries develop. It is one of many tools that we use. And with that, in the case of Myanmar and Cambodia, we give them privileged access to our market. while helping them to develop in certain cases, but also not asking for the correspondent opening of their markets. It's asymmetric. But in these cases, they also commit to follow certain international standards of human rights. Now, it is obvious that developing countries cannot be put on the same scale as developed countries. But when a country commits genocide, it has to be consequences. If we want to be credible with a value-based trade policy, and there are no consequences when a country is accused, nobody has been convicted, but is accused of genocide, I think we need to react, because we are engaging with this country. We have been making warnings for years that they have rejected. Then we say, okay, if you don't improve, and it's not about Myanmar becoming a democracy overnight. Nobody expects that. It will not happen. But if you don't improve, there will be consequences. And this is our consequences. We would withdraw. And the same with Cambodia, where there's not genocide, but there is documented a whole list of brutal violations of human rights, land grabbing, oppressions, labor rights violation, oppression of opposition, media, etc. There has to be consequences. This is a process that has started. We have also said that it will take some time before it actually happens, if it happens. No formal decision has been made yet in any of the countries. And we are engaging with both countries. And we actually see that they want to talk to us, and they want to see how we can improve dialogue and if there can be improvements. So it's a start of a process. Not easy, of course, because as you say, that there are many people benefiting from the preferences in these countries who we want to help. But at a certain point as well, if you want to be serious about value-based trade, and you don't react when the whole world is reacting, it also undermines your credibility, as the case of Myanmar, for instance. So it's only the very slow start of a long process. In the end, I hope that it might not be necessary to do this, but it's very much in their hands right now.
Thank you. You mentioned Brexit.
That FT, all the journalists of FT have an internal clock when they say, oops, there came Brexit. Alan Beattie said that yesterday to me.
Well,
so, yeah.
Well, I raise it with a heavy heart, believe me, but and I should say that I know you've been waiting very patiently in the audience, and once we've begun this discussion, I'd very much like to bring you in just a few minutes. Commissioner, first of all, could you perhaps just give us a very quick update on where you are with the mandate for trade talks with the UK, which Michel Barnier has said could start immediately after Brexit at the end of March?
No, I have no mandate yet. I don't get a mandate until there is a withdrawal agreement and there is a political agreement by the ministers on the way forward. I suppose that if everything goes well, and you know there's a summit this Sunday, and then there's a vote in the British Parliament as well. And it's been quite turbulent times, to say the least. But if all goes well, that ministers will indicate a way forward, which should be a very comprehensive trade agreement. And at that point, that I will get that we will start drafting a mandate, and we will ask member states to get that. But for the moment, nothing of that has even started. They are still a member of the European Union and will remain so formally until the last of March, and with the transition period probably being decided on Sunday, but I don't know, they will be part of the internal market for another 18 months or maybe 2 years, and so on. But that's the moment where we can start talking.
And one other point, I mean, the whole question of tariff rate quotas, which will arise as a result of this. I mean, clearly, like a lot of aspects of Brexit, this is a big problem for the UK, but also to some extent potentially a problem for the EU. I mean, how concerned are you with the way that this is shaping up at the WTO, with the way that some countries have taken pretty tough attitudes on what they want on quotas, not just from the UK, but the EU after Brexit?
Well, this can indeed be complicated, but if there is a transition period, we have a slightly longer time to solve it. Well, of course, I mean, the EU have, with the UK, they have a joint set of a commitment vis-à-vis other countries in the WTO, and when the UK is leaving, they take their part with them. And it's very hard to calculate exactly how much that means. So we had proposed a model of 80%, 20% to our WTO partners and the countries mostly concerned. Now, some do not accept that method of calculation, so we are talking in Geneva to try to find a solution. Because when the UK leave, they will be an independent country, a third country, and we cannot manage their quotas. Absolutely not. That's not our task. But it is in our interest to see that a good solution is happening, and we are working tightly to try to feel. We haven't found that solution yet, and some countries are more concerned than others. But there is a dialogue, and I hope we'll find a way.
And then finally, just before turning for audience questions, I wonder if Mr. Linkevicius, you could just tell us briefly, as a business person in Lithuania and an export-oriented one, including exports to the UK, could you tell us a bit about how the Brexit uncertainty has affected your business, and what you as a business person want to see, not just from how the UK handles the trade aspect of Brexit, but how the EU 27 handle it as well?
Of course, it's a pity things, and everybody's still dreaming what will be maybe some changes, will be the new referendum or something like that, and the UK will turn back. Yeah, still a lot of businesses believes, but there is some possibility. I think they will believe then 31st of March will come, this exactly day. Regarding the business, of course, we can see the slowdown, the business activities. Still there is an untrustability in both parties, how it will be later on. And if in the past we tolerate some delay payments from UK, now of course this kind of things are much more tighter, and both parties are losing on that. And it would be nice nevertheless to have this real free trade agreement, which will be fixed, which will protect the business and would give the possibility future to develop our relations with UK. At that current situation, of course, we feel that slow down demand from UK, slow down UK's demand from abroad, if there is a prepayment conditions and so on. That's not create the trustability. We still believe in some dream, but maybe will be some changes.
Yes. Thank you very much to everyone in the audience for your patience. At this point, I would like to open up to questions. So I'm hoping to see some hands shoot up. Please feel free to address your questions to one or more panelists, and equally, if any panelists want to come in on a question that's not addressed to them, please raise your hand. So I saw first the lady in the center. Is there a microphone? Yeah, there should be a microphone coming for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. Welcome.
Okay.
I just would like to say that, first of all, we have several candidates for the presidency in Lithuania. Very good. The second point I would like to say to our guests that we have several consumer organizations, and they are bigger and more experienced. So to get into local knowledge, what is going on in Lithuania. So we in the midst of the presidential election race, and also there are a lot of candidates at different attitudes. So on occasions that we have so high level panel, I would like to ask Cecilia one question. We are not happy with Brexit agreement. It's not the best. And my point is that in negotiations, it was like focused on ambassadors who are present, representatives of governments who are present in Brussels. And it's a little bit out of touch of local environment. So not all messages went through. I would like to ask to ensure somehow broader discussion on trade agreement if it comes. Somehow it's institutional thinking. Then for the Director General, could I ask you actually what reforms you are proposing? Because it's obvious that America is not happy, United States are not happy, and several countries are not happy. It's for our local environment, just briefly, a couple words to understand why they are arguing somewhere outside Lithuania. For our Finnish colleague, I just would like to ask how you are going to deal with this issue that United States are not happy in trade war with China, let's say softly. So you are always getaway for Asian countries. How are you going to steer through this environment? What is your position? And the last question
well I think this is the fourth one.
No, this is one question. To our foreign minister, could you tell to our audience and our business people what actually our representative who chairs one of the committees of WTO are negotiating on behalf of Lithuania?
All right, thank you. Right, who would like to start? Commissioner or Foreign Minister? Would you like to? Yes. Well, you were nominated, but I don't mind. Or Commissioner, if you want to start, that's also fine. Whichever.
Well, on Brexit, we're not negotiating any trade agreement yet. But if it goes what is planned, there will be a mandate to start negotiating. The Commission will publish the draft mandate, and then we hope that the Council will decide to also publish the final mandate for full transparency. And then, of course, there will be, as always, engagement with the civil society. There will be the advisory group. There will be a lot of debate, and we will try to make this as transparent and inclusive as possible once we know what exactly to negotiate. But I would envisage it to be quite an ambitious, full-rating trade agreement. And just let me say on the WTO, the European Union and its member states have been proposing a few things to move forward on. We will put forward later this week, together with a handful of other countries, proposals on how to deal with the appellate body crisis. A few issues, we have listened the concerns from the US, but also a more comprehensive reform of the whole system that we will propose, and that we hope that leaders in G20 at the end of the month will discuss and hopefully, of course, not agree on that, but at least give some sort of instruction for G20 to work forward on this. We have also proposed, together with Japan, US and a few other countries, new rules on transparency and notification. We are working with other countries as well to have a broader set of reforms. There was a meeting in Ottawa convened by our Canadian friends a couple of weeks ago where there were 13-40 countries from all continents where we discussed different reforms. And we are also working with the US and Japan actually on new rules addressing the concerns of the gentleman, trying to see if we can write, not all of the concerns, but some of them, trying to see if we can write new proposed rules in the WTO on forced technology transfer, which is a huge problem, and also industrial subsidies to state-owned enterprises, where China is the biggest but not the only sinner, and where we would need new rules in WTO. So all this is in the making, in close dialogue with member states, of course, and the European Parliament, but this will not be enough, and there's still not enough countries supporting this. But as someone who is really concerned about this, the European Union, also backed by all the member states, this is full support. We thought that we would at least start to take initiatives to put concrete proposals on the table to force others to get out of the hoods as well.
Thank you. Foreign Minister, do you want to?
I'd like to say just briefly on Brexit, so to say, drama, which is really not yet over, as we all know, and hopefully...
We are barely in the first act.
Yeah, European Council will approve the deal. But, you know, we all not just sad, but we also trying to think how it happened, what that means. And still, I believe all options are on the table. And actually, after European Council will probably approve the deal, now it comes to British Parliament, which really quite a foggy situation and difficult to predict. We're receiving many questions from media, from British media, especially what that means for us, and we're openly saying it means a lot, because also 200,000 our citizens. So rights of citizens important, but Michel Barnier and his team worked really quite big transparency. We were very informed about all processes, not just ambassadors in Brussels, but all of us. Of course, not public. Public was not involved in negotiations, which is natural, but member states were really engaged, involved, and I believe we really have no criticism. It was the best possible deal on money, on Irish border, on citizens' rights, and frankly, it was really not easy to achieve. and both sides needed to retreat, so to say. It was not the best maybe solution looking from that perspective, but was not easy to find. I believe really all options on the table, as I said. Unfortunately, no deal also possible, which will be not nightmare, but really drama at both sides. Hopefully it will be incentive to find a solution. But exit from Brexit also possible.
Well,
and on our people in WTO in Geneva, they really traditionally, I was very glad to hear from Director General that he assesses their role as a positive and rational. Currently, the cheering discussions of member states on the trade facilitation agreement implementation, and I believe we are taking part in all possible for us full-fledged, hopefully, and in constructive view.
Thank you, Minister. And may I say, to describe what is happening in the UK as a foggy situation is perhaps the most diplomatic description I've ever heard. So congratulations for your diplomacy. Minister Virolainen.
Thank you. There was one question pointed for me. And first I would like to thank you that you advertised that Finland is a gateway to Asia. So our company Finnair has done a very good job. 7 hours from Helsinki to Beijing and less than 9 hours to Shanghai.
Wow.
So please be free to buy Black Friday tickets this week. But then about your question, how do we feel about the trade war between China and US? So we are very sad for that, because we believe that there are no winners in trade wars. And that's why we urge all parties to negotiate. And Helsinki is also a very good place for negotiation, as we noticed last summer, Helsinki 2018. But those two countries, they are also very important trade partners for us. So both belong to top 5 countries. So it's important for us that there are no barriers, and it would be free and fair trade for all.
Thank you. Did you come in?
The brief question to me about what I would suggest nothing. The WTO Director General cannot make proposals. The Secretariat cannot make proposals. It is the members who do it. I wish it were different, but that's the way it is. So I'm very quiet. You heard a lot of the proposals that are going to come from Cecilia herself. There are other members who are suggesting proposals as well. Some mentioned the areas like agriculture, food security, and I think IP rights have been mentioned as well. So there are a number of things on the table. We have to see how that conversation evolves. My role there is to help them, is to facilitate. Of course, they come to me sometimes before they make proposals. They ask what I think or what the Secretariat thinks. We try to give our opinion, but that's all we do. Just to be clear, that's the situation there now. But I think we can be assured that there will be a lot of proposals coming to the table.
Mr. Linkevicius, you had a quick question, I believe.
Short question to Mrs. Cecilia Malmstrom. You know, we already know each other since we discussed during the Business Europe regarding the trade measures and so on in the past. My question is regarding the green certificate, CO2 emissions. Yeah, it was a very right question from Mr. Rupšys. We have the internal system inside the EU, CO2 emissions, you know. The CO2 emissions price per ton raised up 6 times now. This is a really begins as a currency inside. But for the free trade agreements, you know, with other countries outside EU, we not use these measures. I think it's not very equal what we are creating some rules internal inside the EU, and we need to follow these rules. Yeah, Lithuanians follow these rules. We already reached this more than 20% of production of electricity from renewables, and a lot of countries, especially Sweden, of course, they reach as well these figures. But some other countries, and we know Finland as well, and of course Norway, but this is not part of the EU. Let's say, can we use this kind of systems, especially in the free trade agreements, because this would be the possibility to bring another countries, you know, more or less on the same level, because now we are playing with the different rules. And during our formal discussions in the past, you know, we discussed about these possibilities, but still we're not reading nothing inside with a free trade agreement with Japan. But of course they're quite green, they're going to green more and more. Not so much things with some Asian countries, you know, they still not use this. This is a quite good instrument, would be to bring these countries on the upper level or to make equal the rules. Are you planning to do something with in this kind of case with a free trade agreement? CO2 emissions, yeah? And maybe Mr. Azevedo will tell me this the same. Are you planning to use this kind of measures to be more green, to more sustainable, especially as the demonstrations close to your windows now in Brussels, you know? Are you planning to do something? Because this would be real, some rules which could help the countries in the EU to be more competitive.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a lot that could be done, of course, but then it takes two to tango in a trade agreement. And I think there would be a few possible countries where you could do that, where you're more or less on the same level. And then for the rest, I think it's more on the global level that you have to push. Now that we have this big meeting in Katowice coming up in a couple of weeks, hopefully there will be some tough decisions there. With Canada and Japan, we have actually said that we would try to work together to identify ways to live up to the Paris Agreement and what comes after by increased cooperation and by see if our companies can do more in that regard. It doesn't include compulsory limits and standards in this regard, but it does contain clear references to the Paris Agreement. That is now an obligation in all our agreements, that we would try to work in that spirit with countries. But then, of course, the capacities vary between countries. Ideally, we would do this globally, of course, but seeing how difficult it is to agree on certain easier issues in WTO where it's unanimity, it would be very difficult for them. But I absolutely agree that this is one of the biggest challenges for the future, and that we should discuss globally in WTO, in OECD, in other forums as well, how we can push this forward. Because the EU is leading, but there's still lots to do also within the European Union. Some countries are slowing us down as well. So I agree, but it would not be possible on a short-term basis to do this in free trade agreements, unfortunately.
Director General, did you want to come in?
No, just to say that there's nothing in the WTO agreements that will preclude this kind of arrangement in bilateral agreements. For example, if you want to, you may introduce all those kinds of mechanisms in your bilateral agreements. There's no problem. As far as multilateral agreements along those lines, it's a matter of having a conversation. It will be difficult to get everybody on board. But clearly there is room for conversations that would allow for something like that. I don't see a problem at all, other than a political problem sometimes.
France already did that, yeah? Quite good system, the France, and they're already using that very successfully.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, back to the audience. I'm about to say something very hypocritical, which is considering I always try to ask multiple questions at press conferences, but please restrict yourself to one question, at least in the first instance. And also, I should have added, please also introduce yourself. So, who would like to ask a question? Gentleman there, and then a lady there.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for the event. I really appreciate the scope. I'm Justinas Mitskus. I'm an associated analyst at the Vilnius Institute. I hope this is working. I wanted to, my question sort of piggies back from the foreign minister's point about his optimism about the continuing engagement with the US, and there's even some progress, as he notes. I acknowledge that, and I'm very happy for your optimism. I do have a question, and that is the progress that we see tackling the underlying issues that made TTIP so hard? And in my eyes, it's not. And I see that at least in two areas. First of all, you know, though Trump's initiatives are not necessarily always successful, but there's a general trend towards more deregulation, which causes more concerns for European consumers, businesses, etc. Secondly, the Trump presidency in no way helps with the pro-American sentiment that is somewhat lacking in Europe and has become, well, was an issue during the TTIP negotiations. So the question coming off from these two assumptions, and I welcome you to challenge those, is is Europe ready for whenever, the US comes round for a, a value-added agreement should the US come round?
Thank you. Foreign Minister?
It's called optimistic by moderator. Thank you for that. I do not read it like optimistic. I try to be realistic and try to build on positive. That was my approach. I do not shy away from all these problems and, let's say, also, well, gaps and, differences. And I said that the free trade experience is not the best time. It's all obvious, it's reality. So one way to make drama out of that, to focus or isolate and to say that, well, guys, it's over. I'm not among those. I'm just trying to point that there are aspects, and also it was mentioned here, that more constructive approach, and let's build on that. And let's look into the future. I still believe, here is part of the optimism, that it's not yet over, and we'll come to the time when we'll continue to what was done before, what was invested so much. Experts were working for many years. Yeah, that was opposition. Here, sometimes Commission felt a bit maybe deserted by member states. But really, it was a real fight of arguments, and I still believe it's not yet over. That was my point. But yes, of course, we should be realistic. Let's face reality. This is not the best way, and it's not denied in the United States that trying to solve, so to say, all issues on bilateral, not only with Europe but also in their continent, and definitely this is the case. So I don't know what to add. My just approach is exactly also in other areas. Let me mention briefly, because everything is overlapping. It also has to do, trade has to do with environment, trade has to do with social issues. I would say our life has to do with security as well. I mentioned a bit, I'm really concerned about this rhetoric, which is now bumping up, when we are really making bigger this division. And there are voices that let's make autonomous system, let's, Americans walking away from European affairs, which is partly not true, by the way. Maybe rhetoric is different, we do not used to that, this is true, but it would be a big mistake to support these tendencies, these trends overall. Only Euro-Atlantic, so to say, unity can make a difference in the world, be it trade rules, be it security, be it defense, be it whatever. These are major players in the world. It will be a big mistake to split, to divide, to depart, so to say. And there are always tendencies to support this trend. Let's not, so to say, be naive. And my point is always, let's not be part of that. Let's recognize. So sometimes we are really, sometimes even opposing all these calls to create more autonomy, to isolate, and we'll continue to do that. We believe it's right, be it a European debate or debate in NATO or whatever other forums. So that is really not just optimism, it's maybe just call to look at the positive and build on that.
Thank you. Unless anyone else wants to come in on that, then let's take another question.
Thank you. Ekaterina Rayaka, advisor to the Minister of Economy. Director General mentioned and made a very strong point about jobs being displaced not because of the international trade. Madam Commissioner also mentioned that international trade is not always about economics itself. But do you also believe that the trade war is not only about economics? It's not, at least in the not about economics. It's not about economics in the narrower sense, at least, not about the jobs, not about the revenues or salaries, the reasons that are usually mentioned, but much more about reshaping the economic power or political power. And would that mean that actually the risks are skewing towards the worst case scenario that you have mentioned?
Thank you.
Yeah, like I said before, it's difficult to simplify this conversation too much. Yeah, and I will try to avoid doing that. But as a starting point, I think it is very difficult to. Sometimes people, you mentioned that nobody was talking about President Trump, so I'll talk about President Trump. President Trump is not an aberration. He didn't show up out of nothing. He came out of very deep political forces that were in the American society. And that phenomenon that you see in the United States, you also see in many other countries in the world. And a lot of that is basically on economic, responding to economic shifts, to structural economic shifts in countries, particularly in the labor market. Right? So people are losing their jobs. They feel displaced. They feel that the system is not taking care of them. That's a reality in many countries. Now, there are several ways that you can handle that. A very easy way of doing that is pointing it to somebody else. Right? So usually that's what happens. The political cycle is very short. It's 4 or 5 years. If you want to win the vote, you have to promise things that you can deliver in 1 or 2 years. Now, it's much easier to say, look, I'm going to stop imports, I'm going to stop immigration, I'm going to stop everything that's coming from abroad, and that's going to solve everything. Rather than saying, we have a problem. We have a major structural problem in the global economy, and it's affecting my economy too. These new technologies, they're taking jobs away. They are shifting the dynamic sectors of the economy from traditional manufacturing areas to the digital world. And this is a major shift in many, particularly in the advanced economies. Now, how do you handle that? Because there are a number of studies that I can put out here that show that the net number of jobs that are being created in the 21st century economy is much bigger than before. The problem is that those jobs are not being fulfilled because there are not enough people in the labor market with the skills to fill those jobs. And the people who are losing their jobs in the transformative sector of the economy, in the more labor-intensive area of the economy, they are not ready to occupy those jobs. So how do you handle this is very tricky. And I think that the trade wars, they have to do a lot with these structural changes, which are underlying the political discourse that is out there, that is creating also this very same tension that we see out there, particularly between countries that have different models and different ability to compete in the labor markets, in the global markets, in different sectors of the economy. So countries that are very, very, very competitive in one sector are not very competitive in another. But they don't complain about the areas where they are competitive. They complain about the areas where they're not competitive. And they forget about everything else. So, of course, that's easy. If I were a politician, I would do the same. So would you, I suppose. But that doesn't solve the real problem that you face in your society. So, again, you cannot be very simplistic about this. There is no easy answer for that. You can even have, different diagnoses. The problem I have is with the wrong diagnosis. Because if you have the wrong diagnosis, you will never get the right treatment. So if your diagnosis is the problem is imports or the problem is immigration, then what is the solution? Stop imports, stop immigration. That is not going to solve anything. If anything, it can make it worse. Now, when it gets worse, I guarantee you, no one is going to say, oh, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. No, they're going to say, oh, see, I got it right. And furthermore, somebody else is even doing something worse. And then you go for something else. And you begin to pile up mistakes over mistakes and over mistakes. That's why I think we need to have a very honest conversation about what are the causes behind all of this. And you cannot be very simplistic here. And anyway, I hope I gave you a hint of where I come from. But I don't think that this conversation can be had in a yes or no, black or white kind of conversation. It's a very, very complex conversation. I was with the G20 leaders very recently, and one of the things I told them at that time was, this is a complex conversation. And if you don't look at your own belly, if you're only complaining about what the others are doing, we're never going to get out of this. Never. And every solution that we find is going to make it worse. So I hope that, that we can all have this more open-minded conversation about the challenges that we have before us. But it's not easy because you have to recognize that you have problems. And nobody wants to recognize that they have problems. That's the reality.
Just like to follow up on that, Director General. I mean, as you say, clearly there is an element of great complexity to this. But on the other hand, aren't there also some quick wins in the sense that the issue, for example, of people being put out of work by technology, I mean, this has been going on for centuries. Look at the Luddites in England. I mean, people wrongly say they were anti-technology. They weren't. They just saw correctly that they would lose their jobs, and, you know, that nobody would help them find a new one. And it is in the power of government. For example, I remember reading a piece a while back by a guy who'd voted for Trump in 2016, but the previous election he'd voted for Obama. And why? The answer was, he said that he'd been working in a manufacturing industry where production was now happening elsewhere, but that the government had paid for him to take a course to become a forklift truck driver, and he'd found new work. And he said, well, that's simple enough. I was grateful for that. That was, you know, I saw the quid pro quo, and so, you know, voted for Obama. And that, so in other words, yes, there's complexity, but aren't there also some quicker wins? Things like that short training course that guy did, which can help people in the short term.
Absolutely. The problem is speed. Look, technology takes away jobs, and it has all. The moment they invented the wheel, somebody lost their job, right? Somebody who was carrying the cart lost the job because you only now take one to push the cart instead of 4 to carry it. So losing jobs is not new. What is new and very different from anything that had happened in the history of humankind is the speed of changes. Now, I have, again, a number of studies that show that today, the speed of change in the economy is about 10 times what it was at the end of the last century. 10 times faster. So people are going to be losing jobs and being displaced, not necessarily losing jobs, but being displaced much faster than they were before. And this is a political reality. This is a political reality, and countries have to deal with that. Now, the Minister of Finland just mentioned the fact that they have reskilling programs in place. And that is exactly what we need to do. But meanwhile, more and more people are coming into the labor market without jobs. And you have to have two things. You have to get them ready to occupy other positions that they were not ready before. And you have to have a system to support them during that transition. And that means Social Security. Now, in some countries, Social Security is a dirty word. You can't talk about that. That's a reality, especially in times of tight budgets. So all this has to be understood in a bigger context. Governments will need to have a much more active role in preparing the labor force for the labor market that exists today in the 21st century than they did before. I always hear, you know, this always happened and the market will take care of it. There will be more jobs. We're destroying this, but we're creating those. This is all very simple. But you have to look at who is losing the job, what kind of job is opening up, who can fulfill that position, and how do you get that position ready? So it's a much more complex conversation, but I think you're absolutely right. The question is timing. Again, you have 4 years.
Yep.
After 4 years, you're out. Or 5, or
8.
3, or 2, whatever. I have 4.
Yeah, shortly commenting on your ideas, Mr. Director General. To make the picture even more complex, I would raise a hypothesis of global trade, what's in it for us, means that for us, for the top, let's say 1%, it's very lucrative framework to have more and more. Like, I would raise the skepticism about free trade agreements and free trade idea in general in many countries with rising inequality. It's obvious. People see that it's more advantageous for rich who exploit the free trade benefits, and it's less and less advantageous for those hurt by adverse effects of free trade. It's just a hypothesis. I have possibly no tools to prove it or to negate it, but this would explain quite a lot. and the victory of Trump and civil society sometimes not supporting what is believed to be beneficial for them.
Yeah, yes, and afterwards, Ms. Shimonita, did you want to say something? Yep, so we'll come to you afterwards. Do you, maybe... No, DG, why don't you respond?
No, just very quickly. I entirely agree with that. And I think one problem we have is that trade needs to be more inclusive. We have to make the benefits of trade reach many more people than it does today. And I think the technology is there to achieve precisely that. Now, my view is that while this digital world gives an opportunity for the small entrepreneur, and you see many of them out there, making benefits, startups, they're proliferating all over the world. The services economy is growing very fast, and the small entrepreneurs have a chance there too. But the reality is we have a duty to make it easier for them. Because if we don't, it is precisely the big ones who are going to benefit, and they're going to concentrate the market in their hands. And that's what I have been telling people. Look, some say we should not be developing rules because we're not ready, we don't know. You'll never be ready. Never. You are always going to be behind. The economy is going to be way faster than you ever will be. So if you wait to see where the economy is going to go before you begin to act, to distribute the benefits and to ensure that you have mechanism to distribute the benefits, it's not going to happen. If you cross your arms and wait for things to happen, there will be more and more and more concentration on the hands of the big companies. Now, how do you do that? You have to ensure that the smaller player has an easier way to get in, lower the costs for them, make, for example, trade easier for them. Because the big company, if you have something, a problem at the border, that's nothing for them. That's a line of cost. Now, I will pay someone, and this someone is going to figure out a lawyer or whatever. Lawyers always get the best deal of it. So they're going to be on both sides of the border, and they will help you, and the transaction is going to go. It will be a little bit more expensive. But for the small player, that means no deal. I don't even know how to begin. How do I address this? Which forms do I have to fill? So that is the kind of role that the governments have today, is to ensure that the benefits in this particular area of trade is more distributed, is more inclusive. Now, that's another conversation where I think your group, for example, can have a very important role to play. But anyway, that's my take.
Thank you. Ms. Shimonita?
Yeah, thanks. Although Director General gave some good advice for politicians, but to exploit the ghosts that you can exploit, rather than talk to people in a fairly manner, I think what actually politicians should do is quite different. I mean, they should engage into open and serene debate with the society. Then it's easier for them when the problems occur. And coming back to this issue, why it's so easy to sell trade war, but not a trade deal. Again, I come back to the same issue of benefits and potential losses. When you have a trade deal where somebody suffers, some factories being closed, or some production is uncompetitive anymore, then you will have a particular group of society pouring down to the streets and saying, we don't want this. And of course, politicians do reflect on that and do respond to that. When you have a trade war, you do not have a bunch of final users pouring down to the street saying, oh, my iPhone is going to get more expensive, I will not be able to buy it, maybe, or I will have to buy jeans that are produced locally that I don't like. I mean, nobody will think that. They will think about those little wins that might look actually as a win, and politically can be sold as a win, at least for some amount of time. So coming back to this issue, I mean, it's clearly understandable why politicians do that. But what maybe we need to do, and what is more important for us to do, is to have first, this fair debate, and second, what Director General clearly mentioned, is that our politicians should also change the view of thinking. Because one of the major problems with, I guess, many of us, is that many of us remember their parents coming and leaving from the same job. And I think it's still, we are not still at the point where politicians actually realize how fast situation is changing. So they still tend to be a little bit reluctant on decisions that you need to make in your education system from primary school that takes years to mature, to adapt your citizenry to the fact that, I mean, it's never gonna be like it was 70 years ago. 70 years ago, 100 years ago, that was an agricultural country. I mean, who works in agriculture now? 2% of population. So that was not so long ago, actually, in history terms. And now it's even changing and accelerating speed. So I think there is a need for international institutions and politicians and governments in most of the countries sort of also be, rather than try and hamper the somehow like shelter country from change, to be able to foresee and to respond very well in advance.
Thank you. Commissioner, did you want to come in there?
Just very briefly on your point on the big companies, you're absolutely right, and Azevedo, Roberto Azevedo touched upon that, and that is why we focus so much now in the European Union trade policy to really engage with the small and medium-sized companies. Seeing in our latest trade agreements, we have specific chapters. We are setting up contact points. We are gathering different chambers of small and medium-sized companies or organization or what have you. We try to highlight good examples and spread them to the member states. We're engaging with the member states to invite their small and medium-sized companies in order to encourage them and to see what are the problems, how can we help you, and so on. There are different websites specially designed to facilitate. And that's why it's so important as well to continue with the work that we're doing globally on increasing possibilities for women, because there's lots of evidence showing that women are not enjoying the same benefits. For instance, if you bid for public procurement contracts, women are discriminated all over the world, also in the north. So that needs to change. What we try to do in e-commerce, for instance, would facilitate for small individual companies in the rural areas of Pakistan, if we could have one global standard on what is an e-contract. That would be fantastic. Or what is an e-signature? That would so much facilitate for micro companies who have not that access to infrastructure and so on. And then they can maybe employ one more person or two more people, and then we see that trade is actually trickling down also to individuals there. This is, again, lots of work, of course, and easier to say than do, but that must be the focus on our trade policy, to really reach out to them. And by the way, at the recommendation of BEUC, the European Consumer Organization, we are now looking at, with our friends from Australia and New Zealand, how we can highlight the consumer perspective more specifically in those two agreements. So thank you for the input you've done that, and we're looking forward to further discussions there.
Thank you very much. We're now in the last 20 minutes, and I know that several of our panel do need to leave promptly, so we need to finish at 10 to 5 exactly. I see a hand over there. Are there any other questions? So just before I come to you, I just want to lay down a small challenge to our panel, which is to say that I want to close by looking at the following point. The European elections are coming up in May. If a European voter asks you, global trade, what's in it for us? What would your answer be in one sentence? So have a think about it, and I will come back to you at the end on that. So, meanwhile, sir.
My name is Professor Juotka, Rector Emeritus of Vilnius University, and today I'm President of Lithuanian Employers Confederation. Sorry that I'm coming back to the question which was partly discussed by our minister. I keep in mind the agreement between the European Union, free agreement, and United States. Why I'm coming back? Because I'm feeling a little bit responsibility. The Lithuanian MPs, we were too hurried to approve this draft of agreement. It happened in my long life that 4 years I was member of parliament, I was chairing of Committee on Foreign Affairs. Madam Commissioner, you came to our parliament a few years ago in our committees, Joint Committee MAI and European Committee, and we're discussing with you about benefits of this bilateral agreement. And we were very much in favor of this agreement, and maybe we are too hurry, and I'm feeling a little bit responsible for that. My question is to you. It was my mistake. In what stage today is this draft of this agreement on the table of European Commission, or it is closed in the table of European Commission? Could you tell for me, because I'm feeling not very comfortable, because Lithuanian parliament, as I know, it was only one which approved this draft.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice easy question for you, Commissioner.
Well, sir, you should not feel responsible at all. Thank you for the strong support given by the Lithuanian Parliament and you too. A free trade agreement, and that refers to the young gentleman over there as well, between the EU and the US, is a fantastic idea. I mean, it's an important trading partner, it's an important ally, and to facilitate trade between us is, of course, a marvelous idea. Now, TTIP for the moment is neither on the table or under the table. I would say that it's in the fridge. Just behind the Ben & Jerry ice cream there. Could it be taken out again? Not now. The conditions are not such as that we can negotiate with our American partners a broad, comprehensive agreement with the US. The difficulties are still there, the ones that already existed under the former administration, and they were important. The last third was important. We didn't manage to conclude that. And also today, with the differences that we have, I do not see the possibilities to negotiate a trade agreement like that. And also member states have made it perfectly clear that a comprehensive trade agreement will have to include references to the Paris Agreement, and the administration is about to leave that agreement, and other things. So I don't think we can do that. What we could maximum do is to continue some of the important work we did on a voluntary basis in the regulatory area, where we actually are talking with our American partners to see, can we do something to facilitate on the regulatory without interfering in our high standards or consumer protection or environmental. There are some technical standards in medicines and pharma and medical devices and so on. And could we possibly do a smaller agreement focused on industrial goods, tariffs on industrial goods? And that is also what the member states have given us the task to try to achieve, and that is what President Juncker and President Trump discussed when they met in the summer in the White House. So those are the discussions that are ongoing. But I think beyond that, and some cooperation in facilitating LNG, which is important for many countries, and discussions on reform of WTO, I think for the moment that is what is possible to achieve. But if ever this changes, I'll come back to the Lithuanian Parliament and get your backing. Thank you.
There you have a promise, publicly made. We have time for another question. I'm hoping to see a hand. If not, well, is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet? Sir.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Mark Simon Char. I am from Outokumpu, stainless steel producer from Finland. I have one question. Basically, we talked about the US and the trade war with China. Specifically in stainless, we see a deflection into the European market, and as such being negatively impacted. What we do see is that there is a lot of increase in capacity, specifically at the moment we see in Indonesia. We talked about CO2 emissions and how difficult it is to get us on the same platform. I personally had been in Indonesia and have seen production facilities over there. not only production facilities, just also lately we have seen that the Indonesian government has now reopened some nickel pig iron mines, which were closed from an environmental point of view some years ago. Now, there is a clear difference between environmental standards, and not only environmental, but for us it's also safety. Safety is a very important topic. My question basically is how are we going to address and to ensure that remain apart from the ongoing trade war between Americas and China, or Asia here, to remain competitive?
Who would like to kick off on that?
I didn't hear the name of the company you represent, but yeah, I was thinking about that. I have been talking to your CEO very often, and I know the case, and probably we from member state, we have given mandate to Cecilia to negotiate, so you know that we have these countermeasures and we have also the safeguards. And as a Finn, I'm as worried as you are what happens to the European market, or what happens to our competitiveness. And that's why we listen to your CEO very carefully. We politicians, we also want to listen our different stakeholders, because somehow that might help us to understand the business and understand the workers and understand the trade unions, and that might help us to win the elections.
Very, very honest of you, Minister. Unless anybody else wants to come in on that, we perhaps have time for one more question. Is there anybody out there who hasn't asked a question who wants to? If not, the gentleman over there, you had another question?
Well, I did actually. Your challenge to the panel speakers inspired me. There has been discussions on FT actually by your colleague about the impact of the commission shakeup that will follow, not shakeup, but change in the commission that will follow the European elections. What that might have in terms of impact, in terms of shifting priorities for trade policy. And I wanted to hear some of the concerns, hopes, predictions, perhaps predictions may be harder, regarding that post Malmstrom EU policy or something like that.
Is there a post Malmstrom era? will we all be here then? Who would like to take on that one? Lots of looking at each other. Okay. Nobody wants to pick that up? Okay. Well, mate. Yeah. Okay. Well, as long as you're happy, I'm happy. So that's fine. Right. A final sweep up. One very last question. Anyone? Anyone? If not, then I will move back to our challenge that I set a few minutes ago, and obviously this speaks to the question of the topic today of the whole conference, and I guess it brings out a theme as well that we've talked about both explicitly and implicitly a lot today, which is clearly just talking about the benefits is not enough. That people, it's not a message that resonates with everybody, and so there clearly needs to be a way of convincing, of persuading people of some of the things which many of you on the panel would hold to be self-evident, and so it goes back to this question of how do you communicate what you want to say on global trade, and why you think international trade is such a boon. So a European voter crosses their arms and says, what is in it for us? How do you answer?
Yeah, my answer would be very easy. You will feel as a part of the world with all disappointments and of course with all benefits.
That's a very philosophical response.
It's for businessmen, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Minister.
I would say that global trade gives a lot of opportunities for us, for consumers, for workers, for owners, for governments.
Okay.
Well, that goes against everything that I have been saying. That you cannot oversimplify this response, but
well, okay.
Given that I have to,
yes, but if I may just interject for a moment, that's the point, though, isn't it? That,
yeah,
this is partly about selling it, and
no, that's
like
quite
it or
true.
not.
That's quite true, and that is the challenge, I think, because with one sentence, you're going to have 4 or 5 other sentences discrediting what you're saying. So you have to really get into a more sophisticated conversation. But I would say a few, what I believe to be truths. I think the first one is, I would say, better living standards for you, faster growth, many challenges which need to be addressed, but also many more opportunities. Without global trade, your conditions of living are going to be much worse than it would be otherwise.
Okay, thank you. Foreign Minister.
Well, on one hand, global trade is a reality, which is unavoidable, and well, I believe it has not so many options. On the other hand, it's freedom and ability to choose.
Okay.
I would say that trade creates opportunities, jobs and investment, which creates taxpayers, which creates possibilities to do important reforms. And it's also an opportunity to liaise with other countries and to spread our values.
It could be one long sentence. It depends how it's edited.
I think I would say that global trade is, I mean, the outcome of global trade is that you don't need to drive your kitchen chair that your local producer produces, and you don't use your milk pack to call someone. But speaking seriously, it means more opportunities for us. But I want to stress another us, because whether we will be able to use those opportunities for our good also to a large extent depends on us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, coincidentally, I'm last on this line, and you know my pessimistic view, but well, I want to end this also on a very optimistic way. And e-commerce is exactly our hope for global trade to bring tangible benefits for every consumer. That's why we need a rules-based e-commerce framework, and we appreciate as consumer organizations, we appreciate a lot what European Commission and Mr. Roberto Azevedo personally are doing on this regard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now in the audience, is there anybody who's got an even better sentence that they want to conclude on? If not, then I would like to conclude this conference and perhaps just add a little note that I know those who have to get away very quickly will probably appreciate a quick exit via the side. So please let them pass before you all stream out. And I want to thank everyone on the panel and you in the audience for a very stimulating and indeed marathon session. And I'm slightly nervous that when I check my phone after this, a new trade war will have started, and there may be no government in my country anymore. But we will see. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists for this excellent discussion today.